So America's Trump administration has decided to sanction the EU, to go after a group of European individuals. The idea that sanctioning Europe will somehow make the EU capitulate. It's not a tough strategy though. It's strategic self-sabotage. Because when the United States tries to coerce Europe, it doesn't get obedience. It will get diversification, defiance, and a deteriorating future. Right now, Washington is actively teaching Europe a lesson that it will not unlearn and will not forget. With that in mind, I wanted in this video to explain what has just happened here, why this is such a big deal and will only backfire for America, and ultimately what it says about the trajectory of America under Trump and its weakening position. Let's get into it.
This is the Global Gambit.
How are you going, everyone? Welcome to the channel where we look at geopolitics, economics, international relations, and how power actually works, not how politicians or pundits claim that it does. Firstly, I wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and a big thank you to all of you who are returning viewers and supporting and joining the community this year. But equally, if you're new here and you are watching this, then you seem to find it very interesting this time of year. So consider joining that community. Additionally, in this video particularly, I want to emphasize, especially to my American viewers, that what we're talking about is not something that I like. It's not something that I welcome. And it's certainly not something that I'm cheering on. Indeed, there is nothing more preferable, be it strategically, economically, or politically, than a constructive transatlantic alliance, a united and democratic West, a shared front against the actual systemic challenges being faced. So this video isn't about rooting for Europe against the United States. It's about warning that this approach being undertaken by the Trump administration actively damages the alliance that underpins Western, and in this case specifically, United States global power. Because when the allies are coercing each other this much, everyone loses leverage, and the threats outside the room gain from it. Before continuing, I ask you though, what do you think about this? Is it a big deal, the sanctioning of these individuals? What's happened between the US and EU over the past year of the Trump administration? Let me know in the comments below. Now, in case you're not aware, what has just happened? Well, the US has gone beyond just rhetoric and moved to direct punitive action against specific Europeans involved in EU digital policy. Washington has announced visa bans targeting former Commissioner Thierry Breton and 4 European nationals linked to efforts to curb online hate speech and disinformation. These have included British citizens Imran Ahmed, head of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, and Claire Melford, who leads the Global Disinformation Index. Ahmed, who has actually been living in Washington, now faces immediate deportation. And as someone who had to leave the US relatively quickly because of Trump's second victory, it's not a pleasant experience. Also included are Germany's Anna-Lena von Holdenberg and Josephine Ballon, leaders of Hate Aid, a Berlin-based organization that tracks online disinformation and harassment, particularly by specific networks. Now, according to the Trump administration, these individuals are guilty of what it calls, quote, digital censorship. Now, in reality, their work sits squarely inside EU law that was passed democratically and voted through the EU Parliament, and unanimously, key word there, unanimously backed by all 27 member states. Now, the logic in Washington seems very simple. Apply pressure, force compliance, assert dominance. But that logic only works on dependent clients, not on a large, institutionalized economic bloc like the EU, and that's why this is completely going to fail. Now, here is the core misunderstanding, and it is a big one. The EU does not respond to external pressure by folding. It responds by building alternatives. In this case, the sanctions explicitly targets figures associated with the Digital Services Act, or DSA, legislation that governs how large online platforms operate within the EU. Washington will frame this as censorship. Brussels is framing it as sovereignty. And crucially, the DSA is not the project of one individual. It was democratically adopted, approved by the European Parliament, and backed unanimously by every single member state, all 27. So sanctioning the individuals doesn't weaken the policy, it entrenches it. That is why Thierry Breton's response has mattered as well. he openly described the move as a political witch hunt, drawing comparisons to McCarthy-era tactics and reminding audiences that censorship fears are being projected outward, not practiced inside the EU. This is how the EU has always behaved. When energy was weaponized, Europe diversified its energy. When supply chains proved fragile, Europe reshored and diversified. When technological dependence became politically risky, the European Union regulated and then invested. Pressure doesn't break the EU. It institutionalizes resistance. And once those alternatives are built, they're not going away, especially when the political mood of Mr. Trump just changes. Now, I also want to underline that the EU isn't getting off scot-free here. I've been very clear multiple times my criticisms for the EU's complacency, its double standards, or its over-dependency on, be it China's big markets, Russia's cheap energy, or America's security assurances, and that it's taken until now for Europe to wake up, smell the roses, and realize that it really needs to buckle down to achieve its strategic autonomy and global leadership if it wants to remain relevant. But so what actually happens then when Washington starts coercing Europe? Well, there isn't public confrontation. There aren't dramatic speeches. Instead, something far more damaging for American power. You see, European leaders have been unusually explicit in their response. Stéphane Séjourné, the EU's current Internal Market Commissioner, has made clear that the US visa bans will change absolutely nothing. He has publicly backed his predecessor, stating that no sanction will silence the sovereignty of the European peoples. French President Emmanuel Macron has gone even further, saying that Europe will stand firm against pressure and protect Europe's independence and freedoms based on their values and considerations, not the preferences of Trump. Von der Leyen, the EU Commissioner, has also weighed in, stressing that freedom of speech is a foundation of European democracy and that the EU would continue enforcing its laws regardless of any external pressure. So that is the opposite of any capitulation. And behind the statements, this accelerates a quiet structural shift that has been occurring since Trump took office this year. European governments reduce reliance on US cloud infrastructure. European firms push harder on non-US payment rails. Defence planners strengthen indigenous European capabilities, more relevant than ever in the context of Ukraine. And regulators gain political cover to hard code strategic autonomy into law. So that's not being, though, anti-American. It's risk management. It's de-risking, much like Trump has tried to say about decoupling from China. And once Europe decides that American systems are politically unreliable, that trust is gone for a long time. We're only into the first year of this administration. Christ knows what it's going to be like 5 years from now. And this is where the real irony does emerge. By trying to bully Europe, Washington is doing exactly what it claims to fear. It is making Europe more willing to engage economically with other major blocs. Not out of admiration or preference, of course not, but out of hedging. No one in Brussels is naive about the risks and would prefer to deal with other parts of the world over America. But when the choice is between total dependence on an unpredictable former ally and selective engagement across multiple centers of power, be that China or the broader global south, diversification wins every time. And Washington is handing that argument to Europe on a silver platter. That is the biggest takeaway I want you to have from this video. It matters even more in the current political context. The Trump administration has made its opposition to European tech regulation explicit. Senior US officials are now openly describing EU rules as attacks on American companies and framing enforcement action as ideological censorship. The vulgar vice president that is J.D. Vance routinely rallies against Europe for attacking American firms, while senior State Department officials characterize EU regulators as radical activists. Simultaneously, Washington is then trying to have it both ways, threatening allies without triggering an outright trade war that could damage the US economy. But that contradiction is precisely what makes this approach so corrosive. Europe was already being pushed towards taking more responsibility. I've said it already, but security guarantees look conditional. Trade policy looking transactional. Domestic US politics looking volatile. And instead of shaping Europe's choices from where it can have much more influence and benefits to American interest, Washington is now forcing Europe to harden its independence from the outside, undoing decades of progress and strategic benefits for the US. It doesn't make the US stronger, it makes it less central. This is the part that pressure-driven thinking consistently misses. It's like China trying to use coercion over Taiwan. And it's also where the hypocrisy of this American example becomes impossible to ignore. The Trump administration routinely argues, often incorrectly, that the US has the sovereign right to defend itself against foreign interference, against external pressure, against attempts by outsiders to dictate how America governs itself, regulates its platforms, or conducts its politics. That language resonates with Americans for a reason. It's why Trump's won as well as he did. But there's a contradiction screaming you in the face when the EU does exactly the same thing, when it asserts its own sovereignty, sets its own rules for its own digital space, and pushes back against what it sees as foreign interference. Washington suddenly doesn't like it. It's called censorship, coercion, or ideological overreach. In other words, sovereignty is legitimate when Trump asserts it, illegitimate when anyone else, or specifically in this administration's view, Europe. Foreign pressure is unacceptable when it targets the United States, but perfectly acceptable when Washington is applying it, be those adversaries or allies. That double standard doesn't just irritate Europeans, it convinces them that American rhetoric about sovereignty and self-determination is conditional, not principled. And once even allies reach that conclusion, it dissipates, it evaporates. You do not preserve influence over allies by denying them the very rights you insist on for yourself. You preserve influence by repeating and respecting their autonomy while remaining indispensable, predictable, and embedded. Sanctions and visa threats might feel powerful in the short term, but they teach many how to live without you. And once they learn that lesson, well, American leverage shrinks permanently. And why we're seeing such an anti-American or broader anti-Western rhetoric, because of the double standards that one set of words or principles are being preached, but they're not being adhered to by many countries in the West. But in this case, America's even doing it to the one group that were willing to stand by it through tougher days. And so if this approach continues, what should we expect? Well, a shift from this slow, quiet erosion of EU-US relations to a much more loud and disruptive one. More EU autonomy baked into law and infrastructure. A transatlantic relationship that does technically still exist, but it's thinner, colder, and far more transactional. Not because Europe wanted this, but because Washington is inherently obsessed with trying to get what it wants. This isn't strength, it's impatience, dressed up as strategy. And in geopolitics, international relations, or economics, impatience, impulsivity is hugely expensive. But that's it from me, everyone. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then do give it a like. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. And as always, you can find more ways to support me with links in the description. But otherwise, I wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.